Hello and welcome guys to another video, and today we have a hot lap and track guide for both the wet and the dry at Adelaide in the GT3. So let's jump straight into the dry hot lap, then we'll have a look at the guide for that, and then we'll do the same for the wet. Now that we've had a look at the hot lap, let's have a look at the guide. So for the first corner, we take a lot of speed into this corner and we're braking just after the 100-meter board. There is this other marker board, this red and white stripes, and we're using that as a reference. So we're braking down into fourth gear and we turn in just before the end of this barrier on the right hand side, and we're aiming to get as close to this wall as possible. We're already off the brakes now, and then we're getting on the power before we get to this barrier, and it's very easy to trigger the slowdown warning, so just be careful with how much curbing you take here. But we get as close as possible to this wall on the left hand side. We're full throttle now and we're aiming to clip this curb on the right hand side. Put the right hand side tire over the inside of this curbing, and then we don't actually need to bring it over to the right because the exit of this left-hander opens up a lot. So we can keep it kind of the middle of the track here. We're kind of aiming for this darker patch of the tarmac, and then we're aiming to go to this left-hander curb, and we're apexing around about this yellow part of the curb. We're using that as our apex, and then let the car drift out wide. And as you see, this exit opens up a lot, so we can use all of this exit. Now going into this upcoming right-hander, this section is quite tricky, and we're bringing it over to the left quite aggressively over to this orange marker at the end of that curb, at the end of that barrier, sorry, on the left-hand side. We brake just as that disappears off of our view, all the way down into second gear, and we're getting as far over to the left as possible. This curb is, some of these curbs in the exit are quite high, but the entry ones aren't so bad. So we can use a little bit of this on the entry, down into second gear, and we begin to turn in as these two lanes form. So as you see, there's like a little triangle here where these two lanes separate, and that's kind of our turn in. So we turn in there and we're aiming to apex around about here. So we're looking for that apex marker, hit that apex, and then let it drift out wide. And again, the exit opens up a lot, so we can use that. But then we want to bring it back over to the right, looking for this 50-meter board and the end of this barrier on the right hand side. And as we get to that 50-meter board, we're on to the brakes again, keeping it in second gear. Don't need that much braking, about 50%. And we begin to turn into the left around about here. We can use this line. So it's the first line after the 50-meter board. We can use that as a turn-in reference. So first line after the 50-meter board, we're turning in and we're apexing between this yellow and this white part of the curbing here. And again, getting on the power at the apex and unwinding the steering wheel because the exit does open up a little bit for us. But we don't want to go too far over to the right because we've got a right-hander coming up. So we want to bring it back over to the left. You can go full power, bring it back over to the left, and then there is a 25-meter board, which is very unusual. We don't see those very often, but we want to brake before we get to that. So the reference that we can use is there's an escape road on the left hand side, and where this barrier is, so the first barrier that's kind of curved for the escape road, around about here is our reference point. So we're using that as our reference, again staying in second gear, but as we get to that barrier, we're onto the brakes. We don't need too much, only about 40%, and then we turn in as we get to the 25-meter board, and we're looking for the mid part of this curb. So there's a white patch in between the black and the yellow, using that as our apex reference. And again, we get on the power just as we get to that apex. So hit the apex there, onto the power, and unwinding the steering wheel. Now there's a right-hander coming up, so we can let the car go all the way over to the left, get nice up and close to this black wall, and again we see the 50-meter board and the 25-meter board. So for the right-hander, we're looking for that 50-meter board, and we're braking just before we get to it, but we can also use this barrier here. So there's an escape road on the left here, and then there's two advertisement boards, and there's a barrier in between it. So we can use that barrier here, we get to that barrier and we brake, or we can use this 50-meter board just before we get to that, whichever one's easier for you. Use as a braking reference, and we want to be as far to the left as possible to this right. We want to be as far to the left as possible to open up this right-hander, and just as we go over this right-hand turn signal for the street, then we can use that as our turn-in point. So just as we go over that, we turn into the right-hander, and we're aiming to apex at around about this white and black section of the curbing. So apexing there, unwinding the steering wheel and getting on the power as we hit that apex, and we can use this high curb on the exit to open up the corner. We've got a nice big straight after this. Just make sure your wheel is as straight as possible as you hit that exit curbing. Now going into this high speed right-hander, this corner is full throttle. It can be a little bit scary because you're taking so much speed and there isn't much of a margin for error. So you want to make sure your turn-in point is as perfect as possible. So Luciano starts turning in just as this 100-meter board disappears. So you'll see the steering input just begins to start as that 100-meter board disappears. So we begin to turn in for the right-hander and then start aggressively turning into the right just before we get to the 50-meter board. So between the 100 and 50-meter board is where we begin to get that initial turn in, and then we're aiming to just get as close to this barrier as possible. We can use a little bit of this black, white and yellow curb on the right hand side, and then we want to allow the car to exit just before we get to the exit of the curb. And as you see, the exit opens up, so that's why you can take full throttle, because it's a really wide exit. And then coming into this hairpin now, this is a bit of a tricky corner, but we can brake really high percentage because we've got that ABS. So we're looking for the 150-meter board and the end of this barrier, this little orange strip, and we're braking around about there. So in between the 150-meter board and this orange strip, we want to get on the brakes, open up the entry of this corner as much as possible. And as you see, right on the left-hand side of the track, even when we get to the 15-meter board, we're still on the left, down into second gear, and we begin to turn in as we get to this sign on the road here. So as we get to that, just before we go over it, we shift into first gear and we begin to turn in for the corner. This apex curb is really high, so we want to avoid it, but get nice and close to it to get around the right-hander. Lots of steering input, but we can get on the power nice and early. So around about here we get on the power. That's going to help the car to rotate, and then just unwind the steering wheel, and we don't need to use all this exit curb because we're not carrying as much speed as some of the other corners, so we don't actually need to go up onto this curb. And we also want to bring it back over to the right because we've got a left-hander coming up. So we go to that curb, and then we want to keep it, you've got this solid line in the middle of the track, so we want to keep the right hand side of the car basically in line with that. Now into this left-hander, full throttle, shifting up into third gear and aiming to hit the start of that curbing on the left-hand side. So we just clip the start of that, let it go out to the right-hand side to open up this upcoming left-hander, and just before we begin to get to that curb, so just before we get to this curb, we're onto the brakes, down into second gear, and then we begin to turn in here. There isn't really a good reference marker, but we're trying to apex at that black part of the curb. So if you want to aim for that as your apex, that's probably the easiest. So you want to apex there, and then get on the power and unwind the steering wheel up to the exit. We've got a nice wide curb here before the barrier, so we can use that to open up the exit. And then full throttle here, up into third gear now. Little steering input as possible, but we want to be on the left side of the track for this upcoming right-hander. And then we want to begin to turn in just before we get to the start of this curbing on the right hand side. So just as we get to the start of that, we initially turn in, and then we turn in a bit more aggressively when we get to the end of that curb. And again, just as little steering input as possible, and just carry the speed through it. And now for the last corner, we're looking for this line that goes across the track as our braking reference. So as we go over that, we're onto the brakes, bring it over to the left side of the track to open up this hairpin, and there is a grid marker line there. And as we go over that, we want to turn into the right hand side. We want to apex at the yellow patch of the curbing, and then just unwind the steering wheel and get on the power as early as we possibly can to open up the exit. And there we are for the start. It's a very short track, but very technical, a lot of corners. So now let's have a look at the wet hot lap and track guide. Okay guys, so let's have a look at the wet track guide. Now, this is a street circuit, but just like any circuit, it's particularly slippy in the wet. So the main focus is to avoid the puddles as much as possible. So that's why for turn one, we're braking in the middle of the track to avoid these puddles on the right side, and we're braking at this 100-meter board or this white line that goes across the track. So we're braking there, down into third gear initially, and keeping it in the middle of the track, down into second gear, and we begin to turn into the left-hander just after we pass that 50-meter board. Now we're using a little bit of that curb, and then a lot of this curb on the right to hook it round to the right, get onto the power, and we're constantly fighting the car, as you can see with the puddles. And then we might need to just lift off the power a little bit depending on how wet the track is to get it around this left-hander, and then just feather the throttle back in, bring it over to the left. There's a nice dry patch here on the right that we can use to get the power down, then bring it back over to the left-hand side. And now as we come into the right-hander, we're looking for the 100-meter board or this orange marker on the left-hand side, and we're braking as we cross them. So we're braking, and we're braking kind of just on the right of this solid line down the middle of the track to avoid those puddles initially. And then we're braking down the gears, and even with braking in the middle of the track, we're still getting the rear snapping a little bit. Obviously, we can change the brake bias if we need to, but just with the amount of flooding on this track, it's very difficult to keep the car stable. And now we're using a little bit of this curbing, but not too much because it's quite flooded on the inside. And then just unwinding the steering wheel, and we get on the power really late, as we see here compared to the dry, really late on the power. Unwinding the steering wheel and just feathering on the power because we're accelerating in a puddle. Bring it over to the right again, and then we're looking for the 50-meter board, and we're braking just as we get to the 50-meter board, down into second gear, we open up this corner because pretty much the entire corner is flooded. So we open it up, not much braking, about 20%, and then we get on the power again really late. In the dry, we're getting on the power as we hit the apex curb, whereas in the wet, we're kind of getting on the power about a car length after the apex, depending on how flooded that corner is. So unwinding the steering wheel again, and then bringing it back over to the left. And then we're looking for the 25-meter board and this same barrier that we used in the dry as a reference. And we're looking to brake just as that barrier disappears off our middle monitor onto the brakes. Not much, only about 20%, down into second gear, and we turn in as that 25-meter board disappears off our screen. Only about 20% braking in second gear, and then getting on the power just as we begin to open up the wheel. Want to be careful with how much curbing we're using on the exit because it is wet. As long as the wheel's straight, we're usually fine. And then we're braking just before we get to the 50-meter board again. And we're turning in just after we drive over this right-hander turn signal on the street. Just after we go over that, we're turning into the right-hander in second gear, and we can clip a little bit of that curb, but we don't want to take too much. And then getting on the power just as we begin to unwind the steering wheel. We're not using as much of that curb as we would on the dry, just because it's so wet, it will just get the traction control kicking in. So if you're in a puddle or you're on a curb, the traction control will kick in. So you have to figure out, depending on how wet the puddle is or how wet the curb is, how much you lose from avoiding it and getting on the power, or just going over it and letting the traction control handle it. So you have to figure out that. So like on corners like this, going onto the curb as much as we would on the dry is not worth it because the traction control will kick in. It's better to take a slightly tighter line and use less of that curb so we can get on the power. Now, this right-hander is obviously very easy in the dry, but in the wet it's a bit more difficult. So we're just using a little bit of the brakes down into fourth gear. We're braking, we see that 100-meter board, but we can also use this escape road. So this barrier is kind of straight and then it begins to turn left for the escape road, and just at that point where it goes from being straight to turning left, we brake there, or we can use like about a car length before the 100-meter board as the braking reference, whichever is easier for you. We're braking down into fourth gear and just a little bit of the brakes. We're not going too close to this right-hander barrier because it's flooded here, so we don't need to get too tight to that. Just a little bit of brake to get it initially turned in, and then we're just coasting, and we're getting on the power just before we cross this solid line on the apex there. So just after we cross that, we're now on the power. Just feather that power in, and the traction control will help you. And just once we know, okay, we're not going to hit the barrier, then we can get fully on the power again. Now going into this right-hander, we're looking for this orange marker on the left-hand side, braking down to first gear, and we begin to turn in just before we get to the final turn-in marker, so one marker later than in the dry, into first gear just before we get to it, and we begin to turn in just before we get to that one. And then quite a late apex, we're not using the curb with it being so wet, and then we get on the power around about now as we unwind the steering wheel, not using that exit curb because it's so slippy. And now for this double left-hander, instead of opening this up as we would in the dry, we actually want to keep it a bit more to the left because there's some puddles coming up. So we'll see here Luciano just lifts a little bit completely now to get it turned into the left, and instead of letting it go over to the right, as you see that's all flooded, we actually want to be over here where that dry patch is. So completely off the power, now onto the power to keep it on this dry patch, then off the power and onto the brakes. Around about here there isn't really a marker, but we're getting onto the brakes here, and then as you see just trying to keep it on this dry patch, down into first gear, using this white patch as our apex reference. So we hit that apex, then get onto the power and unwind the steering wheel, not going out as we would in the dry to this curb because that's flooded. That's just going to let the traction control kick in. And then as you can hear, just the wheels are just spinning. A little bit of a lift for this left-hander just to try and keep it in the middle of the track coming out of here. And then into this right-hander, we do want to bring it over to the left-hand side. And then just as we get to the end of this curb, we want to begin to lift off the power just 3% braking, just basically nothing. Depending on how wet the track is, you probably will only need to lift here, but we don't want to go over to the right here. We instead want to try and follow this drier patch in the middle of the track, and then just a little bit of power there to get it rotated, a little bit of brake, just trying to keep it on that dry patch. And then for the final corner, we want to make sure that we're braking really early. So we brake just after we cross the black advertisement board for BMW. So just a bit after that is where we want to then get on the brakes. That's probably the best reference you can use. And not braking all the way up to the left here. We're just slightly over to the right, more than we would be in the dry. And then as we approach the corner, we're turning in quite early to try and take advantage of this dry patch. And then using not using the curb, but just getting as close as possible to it. And we're still on the brakes even just after the apex, just to get rotated, and then off the brakes, start to get onto the power and unwind the steering wheel. We're not going all the way over to the left because, as you can see, it's just completely flooded. So for the wet, obviously it's going to depend on the iRacing's conditions for that race. They're going to change every race. The settings we've used are in the description down below so you can test with them. The main focus with this track is there's so many points where the water collects is to try and avoid those puddles and aim for the drier patches, whether that be for your initial braking input, for your acceleration, or for your initial turn-in. You want to try and do that at the driest point of the track. Obviously, on some of the corners, they are going to be flooded everywhere, including the curb. So you want to figure out, okay, is it quicker to take a slightly tighter line on the exit and avoid the curb and just manage my power, or is it quicker to use the curb, have full throttle, open up the exit a bit earlier, but then just let the traction control figure it out. So you do have to do a little bit of testing, and it is a little bit just about feel, but it's going to be an interesting week for the GT3s. But as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and see you again next time.